Okay. I hopefully this is going to be, well, I think probably this is going to be a bit shorter than, but that's a cross fingers, than some introductions. It's a the point which I'm making is an extremely simple one, and it is that revolutions entail international war. That it is the idea of revolution in a single country, successful revolution in a single country, is at the end of the day as delusive as is the idea of socialism in a single country. I'm going to begin 500 years back, rather more than 500 years back. No, 500, approximately 500 years back, with the 80 Years' War, which kicked off in 1566, 1567, with the Dutch Revolt. And the Dutch Revolt was not something which the Kingdom of Spain was prepared to put up with, because it was going to endanger a spreading sedition, Protestantism, Calvinism across Europe. And the Spanish state intervened very forcibly. The initial revolts were crushed. The rebels turned to piracy in the form of what was called the sea beggars. And the revolt in these circumstances, it in practice revived. The English intervened in support of the Dutch, albeit on an extraordinarily small scale and extremely inefficient scale, partly because Elizabeth I was not enthusiastic about open war with Spain, and partly simply because her government was fantastically inefficient, both at delivering functional soldiers and at financing war. That's true of not just of Elizabeth's government, but that of James I, VI and I, Charles I. However, the war in the Netherlands, which leads to the division between the modern Netherlands and Belgium, which the Spanish succeeded in holding on to what is now Belgium and re-Catholicizing it. Various Protestants and Jews fled from the Catholic regime in what became Belgium. So you get split in the Netherlands, but you also get the war spills over onto a European scale. The bit which the Brits will be most familiar with is the Spanish Armada, a bright idea of the Philip II of Spain's government that the way to get back the Netherlands was to take over Britain on the basis of the doubtful legitimacy of Elizabeth I, and that it was possible, therefore, to take bring a large Spanish fleet up the channel and use that large Spanish fleet to cover the transportation of the Duke of Parma's army in what's now Belgium, in Spanish part of the Netherlands, across to England. They were safe enough, given the total ineffectiveness of the British land forces, in supposing that if they could actually land troops in England, they could take the country over, and then they would be in a position to crush the Dutch revolt with Anglo-Spanish resources. In reality, it failed, largely because the weather turned out to be adverse, but also because Parma didn't trust the Spanish general in the Low Countries, didn't trust the fleet commander's ability to command the channel sufficiently to actually get his troops in position and his barges to cross the channel sufficiently supplied, and so on and so forth. And then we get this all the famous stories about the British defeating it, or the hand of God defeating it, because what killed it at the end of the day was a severe storm which broke up the Spanish fleet and drove them out into the North Sea, and they ultimately had to straggle round Scotland and Ireland to get home. Also, part of the same story is the development of the Dutch colonial empire. Again, I thought I might be able to put this on screen, but I don't have, I'm not sufficiently tech friendly to be able to put this up on screen. If you go onto Wikipedia and search Dutch Empire, you will see that the Dutch actions against the Spanish and Portuguese in connection with developing their independence result in the Dutch acquiring Taiwan at different points in time, what's now Indonesia, Malacca, Sri Lanka, Brazil for a period of time, and setting up naval bases and trading posts all over the world. So the Netherlands becomes a global power, and the war becomes, oh yeah, New York as well. What it was New Amsterdam at the time, New Netherlands at the time. The fact that the difficulty in suppressing the Dutch revolt incentivizes the more general movement towards what's called the Counter-Reformation in continental Europe. From the 1560s, 1570s, in Bavaria in particular, we get the creation of a Catholic totalitarian regime, produced in the first place by insisting on toleration for Catholics. And then toleration for Catholics is followed by discrimination in favor of Catholics, which is followed in turn by the exclusion of Protestants from the right to participate in education, which is followed eventually by full-scale repression of the Protestants. And the same technique was then adopted by the Habsburgs in Styria, from the Austrian Habsburgs in Styria from the 1590s, and in Lower Austria from the 1600s. And this is connected with the Dutch revolt through the problem, which is reflected by the reflects in the end of the day the failure of the Great Armada. Is that the Dutch control the sea lanes. And certainly the Dutch, in alliance with the English, control the channel. So the resupplying and reinforcing the Spanish army in the Netherlands in order to control the Dutch requires the Spanish and their allies to control the Spanish road, which is essentially the line of march which runs up from northern Italy, past avoiding going directly through Switzerland, which would have caused problems, but up the Rhineland and to what's now Belgium. And the result of the determination of the Spanish to control the Rhineland is the further aggressive responses in central and west of the Catholic Church in Catholics in central and western Germany, which trigger in turn what's called the 30 Years' War, starting in 1618. So that the Dutch Revolt and the processes which are associated with the Dutch Revolt has led to not just global naval operations and colonization by the Dutch, but also to a general European war. It's taking place largely in what's now Austria and Germany and Czechoslovakia, but also involving Spain very rapidly, and then quite rapidly Denmark, Sweden, France, general European war going on and off between 1614 and 1648. 1639, the Spanish having practically lost control of the Spanish road due to Swedish intervention in Germany, try to re-establish a sea route. And in the Battle of the Downs in 1639, the Dutch violate the Spanish fleet shelters in English territorial waters, and the Dutch just violate English territorial waters, with the English totally unable, in spite of all the money which had been raised in theory for the Navy by the King's ship money tax expedient. The Dutch just contemptuously disregard the English Navy and smash the Spanish Navy immediately on the coastline of southern England, well within any conception of English territorial waters. And the humiliation of Charles I's regime, the Battle of the Downs in 1639, is part of the trigger which then triggers the English Revolution, so that the Dutch Revolution indirectly, partly because of widespread fear of the re-Catholicizing, the Counter-Reformation re-Catholicizing initiatives, but also because of the obvious failure of the English state to be able to maintain things, that produces willingness to act in a subversive way. And the English parliamentary opposition then enter into agreements with the Scots opposition to Scots Presbyterian opposition to Charles I. And indeed, these agreements extend to promoting a Scots invasion of England in 1640 in order to force Charles I to come to the negotiating table and agree with the Parliament for wars. So this in 1648, the Spanish finally give up trying to reconquer the Netherlands. And the treaties of Westphalia bring to an end the 30 Years' War, but also bring to an end the efforts, the 80 Years' War, and the efforts of the Spanish to reconquer the Netherlands. And so that my point is simply that the revolution in the Netherlands has triggered a generalized European war and a generalized global war, which then lasts on and off for a long period of time. The revolution in England in 1689 similarly triggers a general European war, which is also immediately a global war. We can say, actually, I'd jump a little bit back. The English Revolution, the English Civil War, England having invited the Scots to invade in order to force the king to the negotiating table. The king refuses to negotiate in good faith, and it winds up being the case that the Parliament and the king go to war with each other in 1642. That requires a second conquest, or perhaps a third conquest. If we say his first conquest of Wales is under Edward I, and the second conquest of Wales is in the defeat of Owen Glendower in the early 1400s. The third conquest of Wales takes place in the 1640s because Wales goes with the king, and the victory of the parliamentary forces in Wales is overwhelmingly a victory of English parliamentary forces in Wales, conquering Wales for the Parliament. And then there's a conquest of Scotland in Ireland in 1650, Oliver Cromwell in Ireland, and a conquest of Scotland in 1651. That in turn goes on to the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1652 to 54. In 1654, the first effective English treaty with Portugal, which at this time Portugal has fought for independence from Spain, which carries with it independence also of the former Portuguese Empire of Brazil and so on. And the Cromwellian regime enters into alliance with Portugal. That's quite an interesting one because the Restoration government of Charles II carries on with the alliance with Portugal against Spain. It's now thought largely because it provides them the opportunity to dump most of the larger part of the new model army into Portugal to fight the Spanish, rather than having to demobilize and have all these seditious Cromwellian soldiers on the streets of London and so on. The Western design of 1654 to 56, they set out to conquer Hispaniola, but don't succeed and instead take Jamaica. Again, also connected, the Battle of the Dunes in 1658, the Cromwellian regime is at war with Spain in connection with the Western design in Jamaica and so on, but fights on the side of the French in the Franco-Spanish War, which is still continuing. So the English Revolution also carries with it international war. 1689, the trigger is immediate, and the results go on for a long time. We can talk, I think, perhaps about a second 100 Years' War running episodic between England and France, running episodically from 1689 to 1789. The kickoff of this war is what's called the 9 Years' War, which other authors call the War of the English Succession, because the casus belli is the Revolution of 1688, which consists of the fact that the English bourgeoisie invited the Dutch to invade. And King Billy came over with a full-dress navy and army, but then, of course, rather than there being an outright fight, the general officers and senior officers of King James's staff deserted him, and the leaders of the opposition raised rebellions in London and Cheshire and etc., Leeds and etc., and James lost his nerve and ran away, and so that it was, quote, peaceful, unquote. It wasn't peaceful because it led to full-scale war in Scotland, full-scale war in Ireland, all the famous stuff, Battle of the Boyne and all of that, but also Louis XIV, James ran away to France. Louis XIV of France was determined to put James back on his throne and carry out the project of re-Catholicizing England, which James had set out to apply Bavarian and Styrian tactics. First, toleration for Catholics, then discrimination in favor of Catholics. He'd already started on the discrimination in favor of Catholics. So 9 Years' War fought not just in Europe, fought primarily in Europe, but not just in Europe. There's also the naval battle of Lagos and a French attack on Calcutta, which was on the British East India Company base on Calcutta. The 9 Years' War is followed with, results in a settlement, but is followed fairly rapidly with the War of the Spanish Succession, which is in 1702 to 1714. It's again a French war aim to restore the Stuart dynasty. They're just a little bit late with the 15, where the Stuarts promote a rising in Scotland and attempt to, without enormous degree of success, to wage war from Scotland on England. there's a gap then, but then we come in 1740 to the War of the Austrian Succession, running from 1740 to 48. Alongside it in India, the first Carnatic War running from 1746 to 48. But after the War of the Austrian Succession is over, the Second Carnatic War. And these are both Anglo-French proxy wars between the East India Company and the Indian allies of their Indian allies and the Indian allies of the French. Second Carnatic War runs from 1749 to 1754, while the First Carnatic War is stopped, while the European War is, quote, at peace. The French and Indian War in North America starts in 1754, and then European War kicks off with the 7 Years' War in 1756. And that runs until 1763. The Bengal War between the British and the Mughal Empire, who is at this moment allied with the French, runs 1756 to 65. The first Anglo-Mysore War, 1766 to 1769. And then in 1775, we get the outbreak of the War of American Independence / the American Revolutionary War. Runs from 1775 to 1783 and rapidly comes to involve both the French and the Spanish and the Netherlanders joining up to take sides with the Americans, ending in defeat. And in parallel with this, we've got the first Anglo-Maratha War in India and the second Anglo-Mysore War in 1780 to 1784. But at the end of the day, although this ends in a victory for the French and the Americans, it causes bankruptcy of both the Dutch and the French states. And the bankruptcy of the French state forces the King of France in 1789 to call the States General, that is, and kicks off, therefore, the French Revolution. So I say 100 years, because at the end of this 100 years, what we've got is the revolution, just as the humiliation of the Battle of the Downs is one of the triggers of the English Revolution. So although it's a victory in 1783, it's such an expensive, financially expensive victory that the bankruptcy triggers the French Revolution in 1789. Now, of course, the British are desperately keen that the French shouldn't have a revolution, because if the French have a revolution, it's going to result in the French being a much more serious and effective competitor with the British global interests. And so we get a series of coalitions financed by the British for the invasion of France and the reversal of the French Revolution, or attempts to resist the French, having kicked off with defeating the first invasion at the Battle of Valmy in 1792, create again a radically new form of military operations and start to export revolution. So the French Revolutionary Wars are also global in character, but we can go rapidly through 1795. The French have captured the Netherlands, both the Austrian Netherlands, which were once the Spanish Netherlands, and the Dutch Republic. 1796, Napoleon evicts the Austrians from Italy. 1798, the French invade Egypt, eventually unsuccessfully, because the British Navy is able to cut them off from supplies. 1799, the French victory in Zurich knocks the Russians out of the anti-French coalition. 1800, the Battle of Marengo drives the Austrians back out of Italy, and Hohenlinden leads to the Austrians also being kicked out of the coalition. And we have a brief ceasefire under the name of the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, but in 1803, the Napoleonic Wars, again, much more familiar, famous victories of the French and eventual overreaching with the Napoleon's march on Moscow, ending in French defeat, and in 1815 the restoration of the monarchy, but the restoration of the monarchy within a framework of the feudal land law staying abolished, the rights of the feudal lords to jurisdiction and all of that stuff staying abolished, so that the monarchical regime in France is a constitutional regime rather than a although reactionary, it's a constitutional regime rather than a real feudal regime. And similarly, the French monasteries stay dissolved. I'm not going to go much longer on history, on this history, but I'd leap forward from 1815 to 1917. And here I'm talking about something which I have written about in an article called Self-Determination and Communist Policy in the weekly work of the 23rd of July, 2015. The Bolsheviks promised self-determination for the nations of the former Tsarist Empire, the breaking up of the prison house of nations. And having promised self-determination, just as the Bolsheviks and the SRs promised land to the peasants, and the peasants went and took the land, the Bolsheviks promised self-determination to the nations, and the nations went and took the self-determination across the board. You can, if you wish, go and look up all the different nation states which were created as a result of the revolution of 1917. And it's not just the Baltic states, Siberia, there's a whole, all the stands, etc., 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 etc. Much more extensive than the eventual set of Soviet republics, or some of the Soviet republics actually, little things which we forget about. But in any case, having given this, the Bolsheviks wind up very rapidly breaking this promise. And they reconquer by main force between 1917 and 1918 and 1920. They reconquer by main force all the various territories with very limited exceptions, which had declared themselves independent. The limited exceptions are Georgia, which is a little bit later. They end up reconquering Georgia by main force. The Baltics, which they weren't able to reconquer because, Baltics and Finland, the German Eastern Front Army established landlord class regimes in the Baltics and Finland, and it was agreed between Ebert Scheidemann and the Allies that the German Eastern Front Army would stay in the Baltics and Finland as a method of containment of Bolshevism. But the rest of these places, the Bolsheviks had said you can have self-determination, and the places had said, yay, independence. And now the Bolsheviks reconquered them, up to and including Ukraine. And Ukraine kicks off in turn the Russo Polish War of 1920, essentially in which the Polish state intervened in Ukraine in support of the right-wing regime of Simon Petlura in Kiev. And advances, this is a cavalry war, so very rapid movement in both directions. The Polish army advances and takes Kiev, and puts the Petlura regime back into place. The Soviets move troops from elsewhere and knock back the Poles, and knock back the Poles all the way, not quite all the way to Warsaw. And then they overextend themselves. They move cavalry too rapidly without backup. And at the Battle of Warsaw, the Poles inflict a savage defeat on the Red Army, and the although the Russians retain Ukraine, although the Reds retain Ukraine, the Poles retain a chunk of Ukraine and a substantial chunk of Belarusia, which then are taken back off them as a result of the resettlement. After the end of the Second World War, the boundaries of Poland are moved westwards, both Poland losing to the benefit of Belarus and Ukraine, and Germany losing to the benefit of Poland. So if you ask a question, why did the Bolsheviks break the promise of self-determination that they'd made? The answer is quite concrete and practical. That is to say that the Germans in the first place, and then the Allies, the Entente powers afterwards, rapidly corralled all these nationalist regimes of one sort and another into the creation of counter-revolutionary regimes. We will support you. And of course, we know British policy, it's absolutely clear that it was British policy in 1917 to use the opportunity of October to break up the Tsarist regime into a multitude of small states. And so the support for all the nationalities, national states of one sort and another, was entirely consistent with that British policy. Conversely, the Bolshevik regime held the core cities and the core of the industry, Leningrad, Moscow, core Russia. But how are they to feed these places? How are they to keep the factories running? They needed access to grain, which was chiefly in the territory which had been awarded to Ukraine by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. They needed coal, which was chiefly in the Donbass. They needed oil, which was in the Caucasus. They needed grain from Siberia, other resources from Siberia. You couldn't run industry when you were blockaded from outside with all your sources, all the potential sources of raw material excluding you. So it's paradox also that the whites, the Brits supported self-determination, but then, okay, in order to have self-determination, the Bolsheviks have to be defeated. And the way to defeat the Bolsheviks is to support white generals. And what the white generals wanted to do was restore the Tsarist Empire. So that being, and in a sense, we can see this also with Pilsudski's invasion of Ukraine in support of Petlura, that the people at the periphery who were demanding self-determination there wasn't a choice that there was an equal relationship, because as long as the ascendancy of British imperialism and of imperialism in general continued, nationalism necessarily meant simply pushing yourself a bit further up the pecking order and getting the favor of the British state. And getting the favor of the British state meant participating in the efforts of the British state to overthrow the Bolshevik regime. The British state, the American state, etc., etc., etc. It's a conventional thing of the Trotskyists, and I think probably of the official communists as well, to say that what was wrong with the Russian invasion of Poland in 1920 was that it failed because it was a violation of the right to self-determination, and there wasn't mass support for it, and the Polish Revolution needed to develop in its own time. To be frank, this is bollocks. Because we look at the period, the scale, time scale of the operations in the Russo-Polish War in 1920. We're talking about events which happened within months and which involved essentially the movements of very large cavalry armies. There's no way that these developments fall to be explained by the mobilization of the Polish people against it's the Schlachter succeeds in defeating the Schlachter, that's the Polish feudal aristocratic cavalry culture, succeeds in defeating the Red Cavalry. That's the beginning and end of it. Okay, there's a technical choice which is involved, which is to dash for Warsaw. That technical choice has, in Trotsky's view, in his military writings, a political choice behind it, which was to try to get to the German border in order to be able to intervene in Germany. But also that rather than taking time to mobilize the peasantry for land reform in Eastern Poland or any of that stuff. So that there's a sort of, it's a gamble which fails, but it's not that it doesn't fail because it's a violation of the right to self-determination, because they violated the right to self-determination systematically all over the former Tsarist Empire in the period 1918 to 1920, and done so successfully, and continued to do so successfully in Georgia. The science fiction writer Jerry Pournelle is also a right-wing political commentator. Well, he died not that long ago. Was also a right-wing political commentator. And actually some of his science fiction, one of his science fiction pieces was recommended by US Staff College as reading for officers learning about counterinsurgency work. It's quite an interesting piece because it advocates the state of emergency and the killing out of hand of people who are regarded as being providing political support for the insurgents, and the creation of warlike efforts against outsiders to secure that there shall be no, quote, havens of external support for insurgents. But nonetheless, Pournelle characterized the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union as the 70 Years' War, 1919 to 1989. And he argues that although Vietnam looks like a defeat for the United States, in fact, it was an important attritional, long-run attritional, causing the Soviets to spend too much money in Vietnam, which they couldn't afford, and thereby squeezing the Soviet economy. I think that's my own view is that that's a ex post rationalization of what happened in Vietnam, which is not defensible. But the idea that the United States was at war with Russia all the time from 1918 to 1989. So it will be 71 years war, but for the same reason, the 80 years war is a bit longer than 80 years. The British state operated sanctions limiting the supply of tech goods and financial relations with the Soviet regime, which were designed to force the Russians to accept payment of the Tsarist debt. And those operated between 1917 and 1941. Then they were lifted temporarily between 1941 and 1945. And then from 1947, when the Soviets refused to give the Americans naval access to the Danube, and Sovietized Eastern Europe in order to keep the Americans out of Eastern Europe, the sanctions regime was reimposed. It's called COCOM. I can't remember what the last iteration of it, which I read about, is called COCOM. But tech controls on elaborate and complex tech controls on trade with the Soviet bloc. And financial sanctions. And then the financial sanctions were lifted in the early 70s in favor of those regimes which were prepared to play ball with the West and take political distance from the USSR. So the substantial amounts of money was lent to Romania, Hungary, but not to more loyalist Yugoslavia, but not to more loyalist regimes. Of course, once the Soviet regime fell, the mortgages were all foreclosed, and it turned out the United States is not so helpful to you after all. But the understanding, Pornell, I refer to Pornell, although he's a very secondary person, 70 Years War, because precisely because he's a secondary person, he's letting a cat out of the bag, which is perfectly well understood by United States state actors, but which is not usually, not commonly openly said. That is that the relationship, there was no peaceful coexistence. There was never peaceful coexistence. Just as the Spanish state spent 80 years and waged war on a European and on a global scale, trying to restore Catholicism in the Netherlands and get rid of these seditious lower class characters there. Just as the French state spent, I think actually we could probably say that the French state stopped trying to restore the Stuarts in 1759 after the failure of the 1745 rising. But the French state then spent 60 years or 70 or 80 years trying to restore the Stuart dynasty and Catholicism in England. And so Britain and the United States spent 70 years endeavoring to restore capitalism and the subordination of Russia and the various periphery countries to capitalism. And in the end, in this case, succeeded. Revolution immediately poses the question of international war. And that is as true of, it's not just a feature of the bourgeois revolutions, but also of the proletarian revolution. Witness the fate of the Russian Revolution. That's it.